Welcome to PHT in the Morning with your host, Pastor David Miller from the Pentecostal Holiness Tabernacle in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of PHT in the Morning. I'm Pastor David Miller, so I'll be your host today and hope you're having a great day. We're excited about this next episode in this three-part series about David. I do want to give a full disclosure. We often use other commentaries and other writings from other folks when doing these episodes. This particular series, we've used Ron Edmondson, the Mountain Eagle notes, and also a couple of other commentaries. So we want to get right into this today. And we're going to talk to you today about David, the shepherd boy, and how he was called, anointed, and then later how he killed a lion and a bear and even a giant. So first of all, I want to go to 1 Samuel chapter number 16. And in 1 Samuel 16, in the first verse, the Bible said, "The Lord said unto Samuel, How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil and go, and I will send thee to Jesse." And he said, "I provided me a king among his sons." Of course, Saul was a little nervous. He didn't want to go. Samuel didn't want to go. He feared Saul, that he might kill him, as he said in verse 2. But the Lord had told him to go with a sacrifice and to invite Jesse. And when he got there, the elders actually came out and said, "Are you coming in peace?" They must have feared him just a little bit. And he said, "Yes." And he asked Jesse for all of his sons to pass before him. And when they began to pass before him, he first saw Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointing is before him." But then the Lord said unto Samuel, "Look not on his countenance or the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." Now, let me say this quickly here. This verse is one of the most taken out of context verses in the whole Bible. People use this because of certain dress codes, saying God don't look at how I dress or on the outward appearance as far as dress. And this was absolutely not what he was talking about. He said, don't look at his outward appearance, don't look at his countenance or his stature or his height, because God don't look at his physical abilities, but God looked at his heart. Remember last episode, David was a man after God's own heart. So Samuel said to Jesse, "Is this all of your children?" in verse number 11. "Is there any more?" The answer was, "There's one, the youngest, but he's keeping the sheep." And Samuel said unto Jesse, "Send and fetch him, that he come hither." And when he come back in verse number 12, the Bible said that when he looked at him, that he was ruddy, had a beautiful countenance, goodly to look upon. And the Lord said, "Anoint him, for this is he." And in verse 13, of course, Samuel done that. He anointed David. And immediately after that anointing, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David. If you'll look at that 13th verse, it says, "From that day forward." And verse 14, when the Spirit of the Lord came upon David, the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, and an evil spirit came and troubled him. So this evil spirit had come upon him, and some of his servants said to him, you need to find a man who's a cunning player on a harp. And maybe when that evil spirit comes, if he plays the harp, you'll be well. In other words, it will soothe you and take away these fears and this evil spirit. So verse 17, he asked them to provide him one, to find one. And then they said, there is one, a son of Jesse. He's a cunning player, a mighty valiant man, a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. What a compliment. And this was just the young boy David, the shepherd boy, to say he was a cunning on the harp, that he was mighty, valiant, a man of war, prudent in matters, comely, and the Lord was with him. So they sent for David, and look at verse number 19 in this chapter. The Bible said he sent messengers and said, send David thy son, which is with the sheep. So he was just a shepherd boy at this time. So David went and to King Saul at that time. And he stood before him, and he loved him greatly. And then David became the armor bearer of Saul. So you can see the steps taking place quickly, how God had his hand on this young shepherd boy David. The Spirit of the Lord had entered him. The Spirit of the Lord had left Saul. And in verse 23, it said the evil spirit from God. I want you to notice that. An evil spirit from God was upon Saul. That David took his harp and played it with his hand. And Saul was refreshed and was well. And the evil spirit departed from him. No wonder he's referred to so often as the sweet psalmist. So David's career was that as a shepherd's boy, then a musician. And we're going to find out in the next chapter, in chapter number 17, how God begins to deal with him even greater. In the next chapter, chapter 17, the first 3 verses of that chapter, we see that there was a battle fixing to take place. The Philistines had gathered their armies to battle on one side of a mountain. And then Saul and the men of Israel was gathered together, and they were pitched by the valley of Elah and set in battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, verse 3 says of chapter 17, and the other army on the other side, with just a valley between them. And now this is where we see the entrance of Goliath, this great giant. So in verse number 4 of 1 Samuel 17, there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath. And the Bible talks about how great in his size was. His height was 6 cubits and a span, a helmet of brass upon his head, armed with a coat of mail. His height was, the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, or weight, excuse me. And the Bible talks about brass upon his legs, brass between his shoulders. He had a spear in his hand, and one that went before him bearing a shield. And every day, I want you to notice this in verse number 8, he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye the servants of Saul? Choose a man for you, and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me and kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together. Verse 11 tells us that fear gripped the heart of Israel. Saul and all of Israel heard those words and were dismayed and greatly afraid. What's going on this time with David? David, the Bible said, Jesse's son, he had 8, and Jesse had 8 sons, and the Bible said a man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul, and his 3 eldest sons went and followed Saul to battle. So David's 3 oldest brothers was there at the battle, and the Bible said that Eliab, his firstborn, the one that Samuel first thought would be the anointed one, he was there. David was the youngest. But David had returned from Saul to his fathers to feed the sheep. And the Philistine kept drawing out every day, presenting himself. Verse number 16 tells us that Philistine or Goliath for 40 straight days, every morning and every evening, he presented himself with that same words, send out a man to fight with me. Now Jesse had said to David in the meantime, take your brother this parched corn, these 10 loaves, and run to the camp of thy brethren, and also these 10 cheeses to the captain of their thousands, and look to thy brother's fare, and take their pledge, or see if there's anything they need. So David was on his way back, and when he gets there, the Bible said they were fighting with the Philistines. And of course, David had left the sheep. And the Bible said when the Philistines had put their battle in array and armies against army, that David came, and the Bible said in verse 22, he left his carriage in the hand of a keeper, ran to the army, and saluted his brethren. While he was doing this, the champion, Goliath, the Philistine of Gath, comes out again to speak the same words. And then this time, in verse 23, the Bible said David heard them, or David heard Goliath's words. And then he saw the men of Israel. The Bible said they fled, they ran, and were afraid. And then the men of Israel said, have you seen this man come up to defy us? And it shall be the man that kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches, give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. So David goes and asks, what will be done? And he's told exactly what will be done. And then David says Eliab says to David, his brother, he was angry. And he said, why did you come here? Why did you come to the battle? And look at verse 28. Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your pride. I know the naughtiness of your heart. For thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. So his own brother is accusing him of only coming to see what was going on, to observe the battle. And he said, why did you leave those few sheep that you was in charge with? But David's answer to him in verse 29 is, what did I do? Actually, he said, what have I now done? Is there not a cause? I haven't done anything but just come to bring you this food. David said to Saul in verse 32, I love this. Let no man's heart fear because of him. Thy servant will go fight with this Philistine. Now David was just a young man. And everybody else is afraid, including King Saul. But David says, I'm not afraid to fight with him. I'll go. And Saul's answer to David was, art thou able to go against the Philistine to fight with him? You're just a youth. And this man's been a warrior from his youth. And I like this, and we told you we was going to be talking about this. David killing a lion, a bear, and a giant. So here we find it. Verse number 34, David said to Saul, thy servant was keeping his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. David said, I went out after him and smote him, and I delivered it, or the sheep, out of his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. David said, I'm not afraid. When a bear and a lion came against my sheep, I killed them. David said, moreover, the Lord has delivered me out of the paw of the lion, out of the paw of the bear, and will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. So Saul told David, go, and the Lord be with thee. Now Saul offered David his armor, and of course it was too big for him. But David told him, I don't want the armor because I've not even proved it. So what did David do? How's he going to fight against this great giant? So what David done, he went down by a brook. He found 5 smooth stones, and he took his sling in his hand. And the Philistine said to David, come out to me. I'll feed your flesh to the fowls of the air. David's words was in verse 45, thou comest to me with a sword and a spear and a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. And this day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thy head from thee, and give thy carcasses to the host of the Philistines today, and to the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and they will all know there is a God in Israel. So, that's some pretty powerful words. But when the Philistine came and drew near in verse number 48 to meet David, I want you to notice what David did. The Bible said David ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Not only did David not fear, he ran towards him. And he took his sling and smote him in his forehead and slew him. And David had no sword in his hand. So David took the sword of the Philistine and drew it out and cut off Goliath's head. And he brought it back and said, is this the one that troubled Israel? So that day, David went from being just a shepherd boy and a musician to proving his anointing to be king over Israel by telling the story of the killing of the lion and the bear and killing this great giant that had come up against God's people. Yes, David was a man after God's own heart. David was a mighty man and a powerful man. I know my time is limited, and I've not been able to do this justice, but David was a mighty man. And I thank God for this story. I hope you've enjoyed this today and will be back with us for our next episode. This is Pastor David Miller saying goodbye for now and have a great rest of your day.